We're going to be talking about your exposure assignment today. So we've talked about exposure a little bit already, and I'm going to do a quick recap on it and kind of bring us back up to speed on it. So you'll remember that there's three major components of exposure. There's the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. And when we combine all three of these together, what we end up with is our complete exposure. So ISO is how sensitive the sensor is to light. So that kind of gives us the basis to balance the other two out. The aperture, or the f-stop, is the size of the opening or the amount of light that we're letting in. And the shutter speed is how long we let that light in. And so when we balance out how much light and how long we let it in, based on how sensitive our sensor is, we get our exposure. And we can use that to judge whether we want to over or underexpose or normally exposed based on the camera's meter. The first thing we're going to talk about is apertures or f-stops. And what the aperture or the f-stop is it's the opening in the lens. And so there's a number of blades in there, and they move back and forth, and they create an opening in the lens that controls the amount of light that we let in. And this number that we get when we talk about aperture or f-stops is a ratio that represents the size of the opening in relationship to the size of the lens. And this size will affect our depth of field. So depth of field really is just how much of our image is what we would call acceptably sharp, right? We're going to focus on a point, and that point is going to be tack sharp, absolutely sharp, totally sharp. And then depending on our depth of field or the size of the opening in our lens, more or less of our image is going to be acceptably sharp. It's a gradual fall off from that tack sharp point to where the depth of field ends, gradually falling off, getting less and less in focus as we go. So when we talk about shallow depth of field, we're talking about a lower number on our aperture scale, which represents a larger opening. So the lower the number, the physically larger the opening is, and the larger the opening is, the less objects that will be in focus in our image. And when we talk about deep depth of field, we're talking about a higher number on our aperture scale, which represents a smaller opening. And that smaller opening is going to make more of our image acceptably sharp or in focus. So here's our aperture scale, and I show this as a full stops in the upper part of this, and at the bottom there's a little bit better representation of what you might find on your lens. And I start at 1 just so you can kind of see. If we're talking about an aperture of 1, we're talking about an opening that's the same size as the lens itself, right? It's a 1-to-1 ratio, and that's going to give us the most shallow depth of field. And then when we stop down one full stop, and I think we talked about stops of light before, and a stop of light is either half as much or twice as much light, right? And so when we stop down one stop to 1.4, that's half as much light. And then when we stop down again to f2, that's half again as much light. And you can see kind of a pattern that forms where the apertures double every other number, right? So 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 every other number, and 1.4 to 2.8 to 5.6 in every other number. There's a little bit of a glitch, not a glitch, it's a truncation error. So they truncate the numbers, they lop off the extra decimals, they don't round them, and so that 5.6 becomes 11. It just gets truncated down to 11. That'll sort itself out later in the aperture scale, but not in one that you guys will deal with in your 35 millimeter. For you guys, most of your lenses will go from about f2.8 to maybe f32, most likely f22. 2.8 to 22 is the most common kind of range of depth of field. For your assignment, I want you to shoot at your widest depth of, or your widest aperture to get your shallowest depth of field. So if your lens only goes to 4, then you'll shoot at f4. If your lens goes to 2.8, you'll shoot at 2.8. If you happen to have an f2 lens, shoot at f2. And then for your deep depth of field, I'd like you to go at least 5 stops. So if you shot at 2.8, then you would go f4, 5, 6, 11, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 16 would be your 5 stops. And so if you shot at 2.8, I'd like you to shoot your second one, your deep depth of field at f16. If you shot your shallow at f4, I'd like you to shoot your deep depth of field at f22. So this is what it looks like. And this image here, this set of images here, represents basically what the first part of your depth of field assignment is, which is the same shot. So I want you to find something that's a couple feet away, and then I'd like there to be something else sort of 5 to 7 feet away, and then I'd like something to be in the background, right? So that we can see that depth. And so you can see on the left-hand image here, we're shooting at f4, and we have a shutter speed that gives us an acceptable exposure. The focal length of our lens is 55. We're about 1.5 feet away from our subject. And that f4 will give us very shallow depth of field. You can see that the penguin is in focus. And as soon as we start to fall forward or back from the penguin, things start to become less sharp. And we left the camera in the same spot, still focused on the penguin. I'm not changing the focus on the lens of the camera at all. I stopped down to f22.6 in this case, and I adjusted my shutter speed accordingly so that I get an equivalent exposure or an equal amount of light. Last assignment, we were working with bracketing where we had unequal amounts of light. In this assignment, we're looking for equal amounts of light. I want the same amount of light to hit the sensor in both of these photos. And so I've gone from f4 to f22.6, which is 5 2/3 stops, which means I've adjusted my aperture or my shutter speed 5 2/3 stops in the opposite direction in order to balance that out. And you can see now that I have a lot more of my image that is acceptably sharp, or I have greater depth of field. This is the one way to change our focus using the lens and getting depth of field. There's two other ways that we can affect depth of field in our image. The other way that we can do it is our camera to subject distance. So in your second set of depth of field shots, you can change your camera position, you can change your subject completely, and you can start to utilize some of these other ways of dealing with depth of field or affecting depth of field. So camera to subject distance can make a difference. So here we have our f22.6 shot that we had in our last set, right? And the background is, it's not super sharp. It's sharp enough to see some detail in there, but it's not super sharp. When we move further away, like to 9 feet away from our subject, and still focus on it, you can now see that our depth of field carries all the way to the back, and the back is significantly sharper than it is in the left shot. And so the further we are from the subject, the greater the depth of field will appear. And the closer we get to the subject, the less our depth of field will be. The third way that we can affect depth of field is with the focal length of our lens. So if we shoot with our normal lens, we get sort of a normal depth of field. And when we go wider than that, we get greater depth of field. The wider the lens, usually the smaller the elements, meaning the smaller the hole is no matter what the aperture is. And that will give you deeper depth of field or greater depth of field. And the telephoto lenses usually have larger elements inside of them. And those larger elements mean larger openings in our apertures. And the larger openings in our apertures mean shallower depth of field or less depth of field. So you can see these are both shot at f11.3, 11 1/3. And the one on the left is with a 250 millimeter lens. And we're 1.5 feet away from each of these. So that 250 millimeter lens really zooms us into that penguin. And f11 becomes a much larger opening, which gives us really shallow depth of field. And so the background is completely blurred and obscured out. And if we change to our normal lens, we stay at that 1.5 feet away and we shoot at 11.3, we get significantly more depth of field. It's not super sharp in the background, but it is significantly sharper than with the 250 millimeter lens. So we can affect our depth of field with our aperture, how close the subject is to the camera, and how long the lens is or how wide the lens is. So for your depth of field assignments, this is what I want to kind of see, is that I want to see something shot at a shallow depth of field where the background gets blurred. And then I want to see the bottom image as well. Something shot at a much deeper depth of field where we have a lot more detail in the background. So you're going to be doing 4 shots, 4 photos for your depth of field part of this assignment. You're going to find a subject matter that has something that is in the foreground, midground, and background. Focus on the midground object. Shoot at wide open as your lens can be, 4 or 2.8, hopefully. And then stop down 5 stops, adjust the shutter speed accordingly, and keep the camera focused on the midground object and take the exact same photo again. It really helps if you put it on a tripod because you'll get the exact same composition and you'll be able to really compare what it looks like to get different depth of field. And then for your second set of depth of field shots, you can photograph whatever you want, but I want you to photograph something that really benefits from each of the types of depth of field. I want you to photograph something that shows me that you know what needs to have shallow depth of field in order to make the subject pop out better, like this orchid here. And then photograph something that really benefits from having deep depth of field. The orchid does not benefit from deep depth of field. That bottom image is just getting too confusing. There's too much going on in the background. So those are your 4 depth of field photos. 2 of them are the same and 2 of them are of different subjects. The next thing we're going to deal with is shutter speed. And so shutter speed is how long the shutter stays open and how long the light is let in. And that means we're dealing with time, and that will affect motion. So this will give us the ability to blur or stop the motion in our photos. So here's our full stop shutter speeds. And I've listed them from 1 second to 1/1000th of a second because that's probably the range you're most likely going to be working in. Keep in mind also that once we get below a 60th of a second, you need to think about stabilizing your camera, either putting it on a tripod or stabilizing it in some other manner, and then using your self-timer or a remote to trigger the shutter so that you're not touching the camera when the camera fires. So these shutter speeds are a little bit easier to kind of wrap our head around in full stops, meaning twice as much or half as much light, because you can see when we go from 1 second to a half a second, that's half as much time, which is going to give you half as much light, or 1 stop down. And we can continue on in that path. There is a B setting on your camera, and B stands for bulb. And what bulb does is it opens the shutter for as long as you hold the button down. So that's just a whole nother setting that's involved there. So for your shutter speeds, we're going to be dealing with fast shutter speeds to stop our action and slower shutter speeds to blur our action. And I want you to think about the action that you're going to capture and that it really shows that there's motion and action, right? I want there to be no doubt that your subject is moving in these shots for both your stop action and your motion blur and the panning if you do it, which is extra credit. So with stop action, the camera is going to be stationary. We're going to have our subject sharp, and we're going to do this by utilizing a fast shutter speed. How fast does it need to be? It depends on how fast your subject is moving. If your subject is moving really fast, the shutter speed is going to need to be extremely fast to stop all that action. This dancer jumping through the air is probably photographed at a 250th or a 500th or maybe even a 1000th of a second in order to stop all that action. So think about that when you're taking the picture. You're going to want a lot of light so that you can stop the action, so you can have a fast shutter speed. And your subject needs to be sharp. This is the point of this shot, is to capture all the detail in your subject and show that you're stopping that action. The second shot you're going to be doing is motion blur. This one, the subject is going to be blurred, but the background is going to be sharp. That means the camera must be stationary. If the camera is moving or has any bounce or movement, then the background will not be sharp. And you're going to need to use a slow shutter speed. And how slow is slow enough for this? It depends again on your subject. What I recommend is that you do a series of photos where you maybe start, so for these dancers who are spinning around, I would maybe start at a 30th of a second and see how much blur I get. And then I'd go to maybe a 15th and change my aperture to balance that out and see if I get a little bit more blur, and then change my shutter speed and aperture again to get to an eighth of a second. And then I might even go all the way to a quarter of a second and balance that out too. Then I can come back to my computer and look at those 4 different exposures, and I can choose the one that gives me enough blur to show motion to make sure that there's no doubt that there's motion happening there, but not so much blur that it obscures my subject. If you shoot at too long of a shutter speed, then your subject could just disappear out of the image. You can see this dancer's left arm is sort of moving very fast in front of that light standard on the wall, and part of her arm is transparent or missing because it's moved out of the frame or moved within the frame during the exposure and has almost totally disappeared. If this was a longer exposure, more of her would start to disappear as it starts to blend with what's going on in the background. So too long of an exposure for motion blur can be detrimental to the image as well. So you have to kind of find that right balance. And like I said, I would recommend shooting sort of a range of exposures, and then you can kind of judge which one is the best when you get back and look at it on your computer. So this is our second shutter speed photo, which is motion blur. Now, the extra credit part of the assignment, this is not required, but this is worth extra credit points, is panning. And with panning, it's similar to the motion blur, except this time we want our subject to be, I should have put in there, relatively sharp, and we want the background to be blurred. So this is going to have a slow shutter speed, and your camera is going to be moving in the same direction at the same pace as your subject. So we're panning. In this case, the bicycle rider is riding across the frame, and I'm moving the camera side to side, left to right, and following the bicyclist through as I'm taking the photo. So I have 2 examples here, and one of them has a longer shutter speed, which makes it look like the bicycle rider is going faster. And you can start to see where his feet are pedaling and where the wheels are spinning. We have more blur, and we're starting to lose more detail in the shot. But the whole of the subject is relatively sharp, and I can still tell what's going on here. He's not obscured. I can even see the detail in the plaid on his shirt. Maybe not all of the detail, but enough to say it's a plaid shirt with black and red stripes. In the image in the lower right, the shutter speed is too slow. We do have some motion blur in the background, but not a lot. It doesn't explicitly say motion, right? It just looks more blurry than motion. And so again, much like your motion blur, with your panning, I would say to do a range of exposures so that you can pick the one that shows the best motion. And really on this one, you can try to push it even further and further and see if you can sort of make it look like they're going super, super fast and sort of see what that looks like. So your shutter speed shots are going to be stop action, fast shutter speed, stopping the action of your subject, motion blur, slower shutter speed, camera stabilized so the background's still sharp, showing that there's blurred motion on your subject, and the extra credit being panning, which is this one, showing the subject is sharp and the background is blurred. What I don't want is camera movement that causes uncontrolled blur. I don't want a long exposure that you're trying to hand hold and the camera's bouncing around and creating all of these sort of multiple images or total blur that obscures any and all detail in the shot. So think about when you're taking your picture, how you hold your camera so that you can be as steady as possible, or check out a tripod and utilize that tripod to really make the camera steady. You can get a remote for most of the cameras. You can use an app on the phone for some of the cameras. I don't know which camera you're using and how that would work out. If you don't have a remote or an app to use, you can use the self-timer. There's a 2-second and a 10-second self-timer on most of the cameras. And so you can set it to the 2-second self-timer, which means you push the button and 2 seconds later it takes the photo, which means the camera will have stabilized out. So just real quick, I'm going to review. This is the exposure cheat sheet. And it goes from less light to more light when you go from left to right. And so as you move from left to right on one of these, you need to move from right to left on some combination of the other two. So if I shot at f2.8 at a 500th of a second, and then I wanted to get my deep depth of field, and I went 5 stops, f4, 5, 6, 8, 11, 16, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I would have to go 5 stops on my shutter speed as well. So I'd go 500th, 250th, 125th, 160th, 130th, 115th. So f2.8 at a 500th is equivalent to f115th at f22 at a 15th of a second. So you need to balance those out. Now, a 15th of a second is not hand holdable. We really want to be at a 60th, which is now 2 steps back to the left. So I could, if I needed to, if I couldn't stabilize my camera, I could go 2 steps more on the bottom. So I could go 1, 2, 3 steps in shutter speed and then 2 steps in ISO and end up at ISO 400 at a 60th of a second at f22. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. I'll be putting up more information about equivalent exposures and ways to calculate them, and hopefully that'll help you out. But that's your assignment for this week. I will talk to you soon.